Squid Game has landed back on our screens with Season 2 of the show, and before it aired, I was wondering if Gi-Hun was going to be going through the exact same games that we saw in Season 1 of the show, or if he was going to be facing new challenges. Within this new season, there weren't quite as many games as the first installment, but if you include the games that the recruiter put upon Woo-seok and his boss before we went to the island, there were a total of 5 games that the contestants participated in. So with that, I thought I'd explain every game, including the minigames that made up the Six-Legged Pentathlon in the new season of the show. Here is Squid Game Season 2, Every Game Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Game 1, Rock Paper Scissors -1. The first game that we saw in the show was being hosted by the recruiter, and the participants were Woo-seok and his boss. They participated in a two-handed variation of the popular game Rock Paper Scissors called Rock Paper Scissors -1, and it was accompanied with Russian roulette to increase the stakes and make it more deadly. When playing this game, players use both of their hands when doing rock, paper, scissors, and once they've drawn, -1 is then shouted, and whoever holds the winning hand based on which single hand is left is victorious. As we saw in the show, each round's loser was met with the chamber of a gun being spun with a singular bullet being inside of it, and the trigger would then be pulled towards them. If the bullet wasn't within the chamber, then they'd move on to the next round. The game is ultimately lost when a player is killed. The players had a 1 in 6 chance of being killed, and because the game was going on for too long, the recruiter put 5 bullets in the chamber to change the odds in favor of death, rather than life. Something which made the game significantly more unfair. This was a game that wasn't necessarily the most creative one, as it was relatively basic and it didn't require that much in terms of a set. But it was definitely a tense one because it was intimate, it was between 2 friends, and we saw the likelihood of death being high because it was played until there was a loser. This is also a version of the game that is mostly popular in Korea without the Russian roulette being included. Game 2, Russian Roulette. The second game that we saw in Season 2 of the show was between the recruiter and also Gi-Hun. Like with Rock Paper Scissors -1, the both of them played Russian roulette. 1 bullet in the chamber, it gets spun around, the trigger is pulled, and if you're unlucky, you end up dying. However, we saw a version where the chamber was never reset after the trigger was pulled, meaning that there was 1 bullet that was inside of it that was constantly going round and being worked towards. This meant that it was a game of luck even more, but the more it went on, the lower your chances of being able to survive were, because it was always inevitable that the bullet was going to be fired. Within the show, Gi-Hun got extremely lucky as the bullet ultimately landed on the 6th press and the recruiter ended up being killed. But again, this was a game where the only way that it was going to end was with somebody being killed. Game 3, Red Light, Green Light. This is a game that appeared in the first season of the show, and because it was such a popular one, it made it into the story in Season 2 as well. The rules of this game are pretty simple. When the light is red, you stay extremely still. Then, when it goes green, you have to make it to the other side of the room. This all has to be done within a certain time frame as well. If you move when the light is red, then the doll, which is named Jonghi, uses its motion sensors to call you out, and then the soldiers that are away in the distance fire their snipers at you and eliminate you, ultimately rendering you dead. This also happens if you don't make it over the finish line by the time that the clock runs down. As we saw in this season of the show, there are a few ways that you can increase your chances of surviving. The first is that if you're not facing the doll, then it can't track your mouth movements, so you can communicate. And another is that if you get in a line by height order, then there's a level of protection, because you'll always be blocked by the person in front of you. This is definitely one of the most iconic games in Squid Game, and it always proves to be one of the most deadly, eliminating a large number of players. Red Light, Green Light is a game that's known by that name, as well as many others around the world, and it's a popular children's game that's often played in the playground. Game 4, the Six-Legged Pentathlon. This was a game that was made up of 5 mini-games, as the participants were split off into groups of 5, and each member of the team was assigned one of the games as they had to work their way through them as they met each game around a racing track, whilst they all had one of their legs tied to somebody else's. Something which made it difficult to resume a game if they failed and had to pick a part of it up. The first game that they had to play was Ddakji. This was a game that we saw in the first season of the show when people were recruited to the games. Players have to essentially use their own Ddakji in order to flip over the opposing colour that's in front of them. It has to be thrown down in a way with power so that it flips over, and then once it's flipped, the players are able to move on to the next game in the six-legged triathlon. However, that game would not be completed until it was flipped over. The second game was called Flying Stone. This was one where the participant had two stones, one that was in their hand and one that was in the distance. The player would have to stand behind a line that was established, and whilst behind that line they'd need to throw their stone at the one in the distance. If they hit the stone and knocked it over, then they'd win, and they'd be able to move on to the next one. However, if they threw the stone, knocked over the other one, but their foot was over the line, then it would be rendered a foul, and they'd have to do it again. This was one that I thought looked quite easy, but then again, I've never played it before. The third game in the triathlon was Gongi. This looked like one of the more difficult games to play because it required being able to balance the tiny stones and also catch them as well. There were multiple levels to this game, and we saw Ddakji carrying it out. Within this game, there are 5 stones. Level 1 is throwing one stone up in the air, and whilst it's airborne, the player has to pick up the other stones one by one. This is repeated until they have all of them. Then level 2 is the same, but instead of picking up one stone, the player picks up 2 at a time. Level 3 sees the player do the same but pick up 3 stones whilst one is in the air. Then level 4 sees the player throw 1 stone in the air and collect all 4 stones from the table. Finally, level 5 is played once the player has all of the 5 stones in their hand. They throw them all, catch them on the back of their hand, and then they have to flip their hand over and catch them before they drop. This is a game that's also known as Korean Jacks and 7 stones. Once this is done without failing or dropping a stone, then it's complete and the player could move on to the next one. The fourth game was called Spinning Top. Within this game, the player had to wrap a piece of string around an object that would spin on the ground once it would be released from the string in the correct manner with the force that it needed. If it wasn't released correctly, it wouldn't be able to spin. There needed to be enough movement on the ground for the soldier to see it as a victory. Once it had completed spinning, then the players could then move on. The final game in this triathlon was called Jegi. This is a traditional Korean game where a player kicks a paper Jegi in the air, and in the context of this triathlon, a player had to kick it in the air 5 times without it dropping on the ground. Once all of the games were completed, the players had to cross the finish line before the timer ran down. This would ensure their survival. If they didn't complete all of the games or cross the finish line, then they'd be gunned down where they stood and be eliminated. Game 5, Mingle. The final game that we saw taking place in Squid Game Season 2 was called Mingle. This was a game that looked absolutely horrific and brutal to be a part of, especially if you lost it. All of the contestants were in a large room on a carousel that spun around whilst a children's song was playing in the background, something which added a really haunting element to it. When the music stopped, a number would be called out loud, and that meant that you had to get in a group of that size and enter a room. If you didn't make it into a room with the number of people that was stated, then you'd be gunned down outside, and if you didn't have that amount of people in the room with you, but you did make it into a room, you still weren't safe, as the soldiers would come in and gun you down there. This was genuinely a horrific one to watch, especially when the people were being killed, because it was simply brutal and it looked so inhumane. This was a game that also tested loyalties, as for example, if you were in a group of 5 and the number 4 was called out, it made you wonder if people would split off into a group of 3 and 2 so nobody got left behind, or if 4 people would join forces and ensure that they were safe and abandon a singular person. The main way to defeat this game was to make it into the rooms with the right amount of people across all of the rounds until the soldiers said that the game was over. In terms of comparing these games to the games that featured in the first season of the show, I'd probably argue that the first season had a few more creative games than season 2, and they were also a lot more difficult. The likes of Dalgorn, Marbles, and the Glass Stepping Stones, they all felt a lot more difficult to win for sure. So, there you have it, Squid Game Season 2, Every Game Explained. If you want to see a breakdown of Squid Game Season 2 and the ending explained, then click on the card in the top corner, it'll be up there. Or alternatively, you can head over to my channel where you'll find more of your favourite TV series and movies being broken down. What was your favourite game? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.